Welcome back. This is the third mini video lecture related to Chapter 14, Part 1, looking at the links between fiscal policy and unemployment. But as you will recall from the first two videos, what we're really thinking about is the connection between spending, aggregate demand, and GDP as a whole. So, jumping ahead to where we left off, we had just finished describing the aggregate consumption function. So we assume that households are a big, important component of spending, and the way we represent household spending is with the consumption model. So remember, spending independent of income is C0, autonomous spending, and as income rises, as Y increases, we see more consumption in absolute terms. Okay, so output versus demand. Well, in equilibrium, we assume that output is equal to aggregate demand for domestic goods and services. So this is to say that sometimes firms may produce more than households will purchase, and occasionally firms may produce less than households want to purchase, or that households and the government and people abroad and so forth are looking to spend. But remember, in our very simple story where we have two sectors of the economy, households and firms, we assume that there will be times where demand is equal to output. And here, confusingly, we are representing output with a Y, and we are representing aggregate demand, which is also Y, which is also GDP, as aggregate demand, or AD, to keep it just a little more distinct. Are firms operating at full capacity utilization? Are they producing all possible output with given resources, which is to say labor and physical capital? If they are not operating at full capacity, then we assume that the price level can remain constant. This implies that firms have slack. They can increase output or reduce output without changing prices. And remember, in our simplified model, we have two components of aggregate demand: consumption and investment expenditure. These have autonomous components, C0 and I0, which both do not change when income, Y, changes. So, how do we represent aggregate demand visually? Well, if aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment expenditure, then we can expand this out to say that aggregate demand is equal to C0 plus C1 times Y plus investment expenditure. Another way of writing this is to say that aggregate demand is equal to C0, autonomous spending, plus the marginal propensity to consume multiplied by income, Y, plus investment expenditure. The intercept of this function is going to be exogenous or autonomous spending, which is spending that's going to happen regardless of what people's income is. C0 plus I0 is baseline spending in our economy, independent of income. But then as soon as income starts to rise, we expect more expenditure. And that's because of this component of aggregate demand, C1 multiplied by Y. The marginal propensity to consume times Y. So if people spend 75% of their income, then we assume that as income rises, we're going to see a subsequent increase in aggregate demand of 0.75 times whatever that increase in income was. So how do we represent equilibrium in this system? Well, recall that equilibrium occurs when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate income or aggregate output. So the way we represent this is by looking at where our aggregate demand function intersects a 45-degree line along which output is equal to aggregate demand. So along this 45-degree line, all output is equal to demand. Essentially, people are buying up all of the output that has been produced. And along this line here, we have our unique aggregate demand, C0 plus I0 plus C1 times Y. We have a unique equilibrium point where these two intersect. And if we walk down from there, we get our equilibrium income. and I'll jump back to that previous slide because it was covered with the graphic that I couldn't turn off. Y star here is equilibrium output. If